Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the thematic event on the private sector engagement. My name is Katia Semyonova, and I'm working with the Climate Change Secretariat. I'm also SBI coordinator. I would like to start this important event by emphasizing that achieving the goal of the Paris Agreement requires fundamental shift and transformation of economy and society toward carbon neutral and resilient future. National governments alone cannot deal with this immense task. And this is why participation and engagement by so-called non-party stakeholders, including private sector, subnational governments, civil society, cities, and financial institutions is critical to deliver towards the objectives of the Paris Agreement. This is clearly recognized by the COP decision from Paris, which welcomes the efforts of all these non-party stakeholders and invites them to scale up their efforts and support stronger climate change action, and also to engage in a number of UNFCCC activities, such as the process and meeting in which we are engaged today. This is why I'm really very pleased to welcome you to this important event and to highlight that I expect that this event will be important and essential to explore the role of the private sector in delivering win-win opportunities for mitigation, and also in showcasing innovative solutions to reduce carbon emissions and increase resilience. I would like, before turning the floor to our moderator for the session today, to highlight what kind of arrangement we have in terms of agenda today. We'll start with two keynote presentations by Mr. Matthew Reddy from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Then we'll continue with the presentation of Mr. Theo de Jager from the World Farmer Organization. And then we have a wonderful panel that join us for this particular session that will provide their views on this important topic. And the panel includes Mr. Romano di Vivo, Mr. Chris Brown, Mr. Bernhard Stormyr, and then Mr. Gábor Figeczky. Now, without any more words of introduction, I would like to turn the floor to the moderator for the session today, Mr. Conor Lenon from ABB, who will guide us through this important and interesting discussion and session. Please.
Thank you very much, Katia. We do want to make this session as interactive as possible. So after the keynote speeches and the interventions from the expert panel, we would like, as soon as possible, to hold it over to you for questions. If you do want to ask a question and you're around the table, please don't forget to put your hand up and put on your microphone. And if you're sitting on the chairs around the table, there is a microphone, or there will be a microphone somewhere, which will come around so we can all hear you here. As Katia said, we'll be starting off with a keynote speech from Matthew Reddy from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and then another keynote from Theo de Jager from the World Farmer Organization. So I think let's just get straight into it. Matthew, if you could take us through your keynote speech, please.
Thank you, Conor, for the introduction, and it's a delight to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Matthew Reddy from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. I know this session is on the private sector, and the World Business Council doesn't purport to represent the private sector. We represent the progressive and forward-thinking side of the private sector. So I wanted to make that point clear before we start. In this session, I'm going to put some framing around what we're doing in terms of agriculture, and to touch a little bit on forestry, but our program is around climate smart agriculture. So I'm going to reflect a little bit on what we do, what our members do, and the partnerships that we have with climate smart agriculture, and provide some framing for that. And then we'll have our members here that will be able to then go deeper into some of the business solutions, and that will provide, I think, you with some opportunities to investigate a little bit further some of these opportunities around CSA. So what is climate smart agriculture? And I think when we think about climate smart agriculture, people latch on to the word climate, and they think it is a mitigation approach for greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture. Yes, that is part of it, but primarily climate smart agriculture is more on the smart agriculture side, the sustainable agriculture side, where we're looking to be able to improve and maintain production in light of more variable climatic conditions. And this is, I guess, the idea that CSA is around building resilience in our systems, increasing and closing yield gaps in productivity. And as a result of more sustainable farming practices, we will then be able to derive some quite extensive emissions reductions or emissions intensity improvements as well through agricultural systems. Climate smart agriculture, I guess, is not a silver bullet. And then, we recognise that this is an evolution of the sustainable agriculture development. So the title of this session is around ambitious mitigation goals. And I think what we did when we started this process way back in just before Paris COP21, we said, well, what's the vision for the group? What is it that we can do in terms of a goal and a target for climate smart agriculture? And so we said, well, let's start with that productivity piece. Let's make sure that we emphasise what we're here to do. And the idea is to make 50% more food available. You'll note the careful selection of the wording here, make more food available, not increase production, because we recognise food losses and the waste from food should be incorporated into any targets. So, and the greenhouse gas footprint that the food loss and waste has, as we know, it's quite significant. And at the same time, reduce agricultural and land use change emissions by 50%. So make 50% more food available and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50%. These figures are derived from a cessation of deforestation and 50% reduction in food loss and waste. So that's before we even get into greenhouse gas reduction programs on farm. Here are our members. So WBCSD is a membership-based organisation. We're headquartered in Geneva, but we have global members that have joined our program to work on the CSA initiative. And I think one of the things that brings us together, yes, of course, it started with Paris and COP21, but really it's the SDG framing that is a real glue for what we're doing. And in particular, when you think about SDGs, you might think, oh, SDG 2, ending hunger and sustainable agriculture, or SDG 13 around climate change. But really the focus of our group is around SDG 17. If we look at the partnerships approach, the opportunities for collaboration, if you look at what the targets are there, and I'll read them to you, the targets cover finance, technology, data and monitoring, capacity building, trade, systemic issues, and multi-stakeholder partnerships. These are all roles that must engage the private sector, and this is where the private sector feels that it has opportunities to be most useful in meeting the targets, whether they be under the UNFCCC or UNCCD or indeed the SDGs. And what we'll hear from our panel is that the best results can only come from multi-stakeholder partnerships. The partnerships that we have include CCAFs. I'm looking around the room trying to see some of our CCAFs colleagues here. I can't see any, but they provide us with a great deal of expertise in terms of monitoring, reporting, how we manage the programs that we operate. We Mean Business is funded by the IKEA Foundation and supports our bottom line. GACSA, the Global Alliance for Climate Smart Agriculture. This is housed by the FAO and very well supported by a range of multilateral organisations. And we partner with GEF on a number of initiatives as well. We are here today to engage with partners. So if there are any of you in the room who feel that they would like to work with us on climate smart agriculture, that's what we're here for today, and to discuss collaboration opportunities in the space. I'm going to skip very quickly to an area that we see as ambitious mitigation, and that's in rice. So first and foremost, we recognise that climate change has the variability in climate will impact very heavily on rice. And when we talk about food security in the ASEAN region, food security is rice security. So all of our members, our partner organisations, UN Environment, GIZ, we've come together to form an agreement to work on rice greenhouse gas mitigation. Rice has the equivalent greenhouse gas profile of international aviation. So when we think about emissions from rice, they're not insignificant. There's a lot of attention paid to air travel, and there's a lot of work done in that space, but very little in rice. But we think we have some solutions here in rice. If we look at the total amount of emissions from rice in the ASEAN region, they're quite substantial. And what's most interesting is that for many countries, they make up a very large proportion of their emissions profile, somewhere between 10 and 20%. That obviously, the more reliant a country is on fossil fuels like Indonesia, the less that percentage. However, we can see that the total emissions from rice are quite large. And again, they're listed in the INDC's mitigation and adaptation. The reductions, I note our colleagues from the Philippines here, the reductions in rice are quite large. Chris from Olam is going to delve much deeper into the actions that can achieve these greenhouse gas mitigation approaches. And here are the partners that are involved in our greenhouse gas reduction program for rice. So we are now actively looking for organisations to join with us, not only in our rice initiative, but also in a number of our other programs that we have around the world. This presentation will be made available to those people who have an interest in things like land restoration and greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture.
Thank you very much, Matthew. And just for those who might have missed out, in terms of the proportion of emissions that come from rice, you compare that to air travel, saying it's the same as the emissions from air travel?
That's right.
Okay, right. Thank you very much. I'll move on to our second keynote speaker, Dr. Theo de Jager from the World Farmers Organization, a member of the World Farmers Organization, and also the president of the Southern African Confederation of Agricultural Unions.
How do you roll it on? Oh, that's sorry. Good morning. I'm a farmer from the northern parts of South Africa, and I will give you a glance through the eyes of a farmer on the role of private sector, agricultural business especially. Now, in agriculture, the market is king. We speak in agriculture of value chains for a very good reason. You cannot push a chain. You can only pull it. And the pulling force is the market. Farmers will always do what is profitable, and what is profitable depends on what the market wants. So the businesses downstream in the value chain, those businesses which operate in the space between the farm gate and the consumer's plate, is of primary concern for farmers. It determines their profitability. They create the demand, they generate the demand for our produce. And also, they set the rules for competitiveness, because they dictate the preferences in input procurement and farming practices. Now, there are different tiers of demand from the market side. In poor communities where food security is an issue, the biggest determinant is price. a poor family will first of all go for the cheapest food, whatever they can afford. And when a family is food secure, they start to look at quality of the fruit, the nutritional value. And only in affluent communities, they bother about the environmental impact of production. So poverty is one of the greatest obstacles in the way of the implementation of climate-smart agriculture. This is the first point I want to make. Important because although not the largest production force, the vast majority in numbers of the world's farmers are poor. A small number of the world's farmers, a small percentage, produce the largest part of the food we buy from shelves in shops. Poorer farmers operate in shorter value chains, where there is very little agribusiness between producer and consumer. In Africa, my home continent, very often you'll find that there is nothing between the producer and the consumer, where the producer is the consumer. Many poor farming families in Africa consume everything they produce. They use their own seed, produce their own fertilizers in the form of compost, and their own labor, their own consumption, and there's very little trade being done. They do their own processing, provide their own logistics and trade exchange and consumption. So there's very little space for agribusiness to influence the way they operate. It's in the longer value chains, in the more sophisticated markets, where agribusiness have a vital role to play. Because the profits in agriculture is in the chain rather than in primary production. In my home country, in South Africa, the turnover in the chain, in the value chains, downstream especially, is 5 times that of primary production. So for every job on a farm, there are 17 jobs in my home country elsewhere in the value chain. You have the producer who has to procure his seed, fertilizer, mechanization, and many others. And for that, he needs financing. For financing, he also needs insurance, crop insurance. Then from the farm gate, the produce is taken to a processor, and that processor sets certain standards, wants a certain quality of food, and they look at how it is produced. Especially in the longer chains, like in the export market, I cannot export one avocado from my farm to Europe if I do not meet global gap standards. And part of that has to do about how I deal with the environment, what I spray on my crops, what is the impact of my laborers on the environment, how do I deal with the river that runs through my farm. And only if I meet all that criteria am I allowed to get the certificate to export my fruits. From there, you're back into the logistic chain to the retailer, and they set their own standards, and they do their inspections on behalf of the consumer. Ultimately, the most important person in my life as a farmer is in 2017 still a woman in a household who decides what her family is going to eat tonight. And whatever she wants is what I need to produce. She wants it to look good rather than taste good, then that's the way I need to produce it. And if she sets her standards in terms of impact on the environment, I have to meet those standards or she will not buy my food. She will prefer someone else's produce. So for a poor farmer in the shorter chain to expand his operation to have a bigger income, he needs to produce on more area. He would do deforestation, debushing, to expand his operation. Profitable farmers produce more on less with less. And for that, you need better technology. In terms of technology, it's about the knowledge, the expertise, the skills, the levels of education and training, and the empowerment of the farmers. The big difference is those producers who only regard themselves as rural dwellers eking out a living from the soil versus those producers who are operating as a business, who see their farms as a business. Now, there's only one way to eradicate poverty in this world, and that's by creating wealth. You create wealth by adding value to produce. That's the role of business in agriculture. So what I want to say to you is, whatever agribusiness set as the standards compels the farmers to change the way in which they produce. More so for the more affluent farmers and less so for the poorer farmers. The poorer farmers can only be lifted out of poverty if we can help them to create wealth. And no sector in the economy of the world has got bigger potential to do that than agriculture.
Thank you very much, Theo. And last week was the World Economic Forum regional meeting on Africa, and many of those things that you mentioned came up around technology and the importance of knowledge and skills, and of course creating value to take people out of poverty. Before we move on to the expert panel, I'd like to ask you one question. Do you see Africa moving in a direction that is alleviating some of the problems you mentioned?
Most certainly. Most certainly. It is possible today, and it was not possible 5 years ago or 10 years ago, because of communications technology. Because so many more farmers today have a cell phone in their hand and access to a smartphone. So they have access to the world outside. They can see where the markets are going. You can communicate with them. You can do extension services through that. Can you imagine if we could have the same leapfrog effect in agricultural technology as we had in Africa with communications technology, as they moved from the drum to the smartphone in less than 20 years? What we need to do now is to move from the hand-hoe to modern technology, especially digital technology, the same way.
Thank you very much, Theo. And with that, we'll hand over to our expert panel. One message we had from Theo that is that poverty hinders climate-smart agriculture, and that is something that we will be bringing up with our expert panel. But before that discussion, let's start by hearing from Romano de Vivo, Global Head of Environment Policy at Syngenta, which shouldn't need introduction, a global Swiss agribusiness producing agrochemicals and seeds, the result of a merger between Novartis Agribusiness and Syngenta Agrochemicals. Romano.
Thank you. So, agriculture relies on healthy and fertile soils and connected landscapes. Unfortunately, if we look at the figures provided by UNFCCC, we discover that half of this farmland is already degraded or affected by some degrees of degradation. So there is an urgent need to act. And at Syngenta, we take this very seriously, and we help farmers to implement conservation agriculture through multi-stakeholder platforms that are providing farmers with a number of services that are coming from other partners in the financial service sector, in the machinery producer sector, in the academia. And all together, we help them to implement conservation agriculture. We help them to look at their soil and implement soil practices that are really adapted to their local needs, but also to create ecological infrastructures that can help them to mitigate some of the impacts of climate change. And we work with large farmers, we work with medium farmers, we work with smallholders that already represent about half of our turnover worldwide. So this is the approach that we believe is important for climate smart agriculture, for the adaptation and mitigation to climate change, because it's an approach that is really leveraging on the support and the professionality of several different stakeholders.
And can you just give me one clear example of where you think that approach has had a big impact recently?
We have created, for example, some multi-stakeholder platforms for the implementation of soil conservation practices in Mexico with local government, with one major research center for smallholders. In Hungary, we have another major platform that is addressing medium farms. And in southern Russia, we have, vice versa, a big collaboration with several different big agro-holdings. So just to show that this is an approach that can work everywhere. It's very simple, it's very pragmatic, and really addressing the needs of the farmers.
Thank you very much, Romano. Next speaker is Chris Brown, Vice President of Corporate Responsibility and Sustainability at Olam. And I think, Chris, you want to just give a brief description of what Olam is for those who don't know.
Yeah, we're a relatively new company, less than 30 years old. So we haven't got the history of some of the other panelists here. So we're a global agribusiness that started life as a trader. So at one end of the great diagram that was shown earlier about the value chains, we've moved back up that value chain. So we're now operating 200 processing plants. We're managing over 2 million hectares of land. We're working with, or we're connected to 4 million smallholder farmers globally, operating in about 70 countries. Of the land that those smallholder farmers and the large-scale farmers are operating, it's about 7-8 million hectares of land. So again, significant areas here. I don't want to dwell on the numbers. What I would want to do is pick up on actually that value chain diagram and really focus in on the excellent point that was made about poverty and the other barriers. So climate change isn't a subject we can view in isolation as agriculture. We're operating in a world where there are multiple challenges, multiple risks, multiple impacts. Climate change is a significant one, but we do need to focus in on other things. Particular area for Olam is looking at the dependency that we have on those smallholder farmers. So genuine business dependency. If those farmers are not performing well, if those farmers are not resilient, then our business suffers. So we're entirely dependent for those parts of the business, and this is for products like coffee, for cocoa, for cotton, for cashew nuts, on the farmer and the relationship that we have with those farmers, which again is the drive for us to move back up the value chain. So we've implemented a program 6 years ago now, so again, still relatively new, that works with over 300,000 farmers, smallholder farmers, in emerging economies. We invest over $160 million in financing ourselves through to those farmers to tackle economic, environmental, and social challenges that those farmers are facing. And again, coming back to the point about poverty, this is one of the biggest pieces that we've got to focus on. So I'll be able to delve into some more detail on rice, as Matthew said later. Rice is one of the up-and-coming products that we really want to attract and be able to develop and explain more about the mitigation actions.
Thank you very much, Chris. Yeah, we'll come back to those points during the roundtable discussion. Our third speaker is Bernhard Stormyr, and he is from Yara, Head of Sustainability Management. Yara International, Norwegian chemical company, and largest business areas are the production of nitrogen fertilizer and also the production of nitrates. Is that a fair summing up of what Yara is?
Yes, that's correct. So we are based in Norway, but we are very much a global company. And I would like to talk in this context a little bit about land use and land use change, using Tanzania as an example. So Tanzania today has about 45 million inhabitants, but their population is set to grow quite rapidly. So the expected population will be closing in on 140 million people in 2050. So we made an easy analysis of the maize consumption and production in Tanzania. So if we want to eradicate some of the hunger but supply enough maize, according to today's consumption, to the population in 2050, of course, you need to supply more maize. Currently, the yields are at about 1.5 tons per hectare. So if Tanzania doesn't manage to improve productivity, they will need to expand the maize acreage by 9 million hectares. So that's clearing almost a land size, almost a third of the German country, just to supply the maize. The other option is, of course, to increase productivity. So at 5.5 to 6 tons of maize per hectare, the population in 2050 could be supplied on the existing farmland, so avoiding land use change. Together with Syngenta and 2 universities, we established a scientific protocol to measure what is the impact of moving from traditional farm practices to a modernized farming system, using better quality seeds, agrochemicals and fertilizers, and training of the farmers. So over a 4-year series of trials, we could demonstrate that just by implementing existing knowledge and products, the farmers in Tanzania can quite easily be raised to a productivity level of about 5 to 6 tons. So the productivity level needed to supply 2050 population without land expansion. And we measured the carbon footprint, and if you compare the scenario of increased productivity with the scenario of land expansion would be about 5 times as carbon intensive.
Can you give me an idea of the scale of that trial, and also if there are any plans to scale it up?
So the set of trials were very small, 10 farmers involved. So it was more about demonstrating the actual scientific protocol for measuring the impact. But what we are doing now is to try to roll out the knowledge from this with the farmers. And this is being done in a partnership together with the World Food Programme and Bayer, Syngenta, Rabobank, Agra, and others, in order to try to reach more farmers and provide them training and access to inputs. But then the risk is, of course, that you succeed and you actually increase productivity and flooding the local markets. So the local prices collapse. So this is why the World Food Programme is a vital partner in the partnership, so that there's a guaranteed off-taker when the productivity increases, so that you don't have that local flooding of markets.
We'll come to Gábor in just a second, but I'd like to bring in Theo, because as we're talking about a trial that takes place in Africa. Do you have any comment to make on that, on getting that balance right?
Yes, it's actually extremely interesting to see how many of these private sector companies upstream in the value chain, fertilizer companies, mechanization companies, seed companies, are involved in these kinds of trials. And then from the farmer side, thank you for what you invest in this kind of research. Because without the R&D part, without research and development, it is virtually impossible to upscale. In this space, there are a lot of NGOs operating who actually preach against the use of fertilizer, against the use of improved seeds. There's a kind of an over-romanticization of smallholder farming. Well, actually, it's a poverty trap. The FAO said in its paper on family farming in 2013 that the average size of a farm in Africa is less than 1 hectare. The average yield when it comes to maize is less than 1 ton per hectare, with an average price of $190 per ton. It means that family has about 50 cents per day turnover on that farm. Who can live like that? You need to leapfrog to a situation where it is profitable to farm. And for that, we need to lure the youth back onto the farms. This is what they are running away from. They associate agriculture with a mother with a breaking back, bending over a hand hoe. If you can show the profitability side of it, producing more with less on a small area of land, you will lure them back. It is often said that agriculture is not sexy enough for the youngsters. But let me tell you, there's nothing as sexy as profitability in agriculture.
Thank you very much, Theo. And with that, we turn to the fourth member of our expert panel, Gábor Figeczky from IFOAM-Organics International, which has been around since 1972 and is the only international umbrella organization of the organic world. Gábor.
Thank you very much. So yes, IFOAM-Organics International is the global umbrella for organic farming, and organic is a growing sector. So I guess this is why we have been invited on this panel. But it's not just the organic sector that I want to talk about in my intervention. I want to share with you my experiences with a contest that we launched recently on sustainable farming. It was a global contest, and we received really from all around the world 337 wonderful entries, where I very much liked what Theo said about the smallholders and the difficulties they face. But when you read all these nice solutions that come from all over the world, then you really have the feeling that it's actually the farmers are the ones who are the best innovators in the world. So I really have now the feeling that on the basis of these solutions, so if we can scale these up, scale these out, and promote conducive policy environments for these multiple benefit solutions. And when I say multiple benefit solutions, I also mean improved management of soil, water, nutrients, livestock health, and nutrition. And on top of that comes, of course, the greenhouse gas emissions, meaning that, yeah, as Theo said, the smallholders very rarely think of their own greenhouse gas emissions, but still they have sort of initiatives which bring these multiple solutions, multiple benefit solutions. And when we create conducive policy environments for these solutions, I think we need to look at research, development, and also extension services. And the emphasis here is independency from any. I know that most of the finances are coming from the private sector for all this, but still it would be great to have independent extension services for those sorts of agricultural models which are more knowledge intensive than input intensive. So my main message is, please put the farmers in the center of development and in the center of the discussions here as well at the UNFCCC. Thanks.
Thanks, Gábor. The organics movement is often framed as being in opposition to the approach of agribusiness and some of the representatives of the companies that we have here today. What is your, is that a true representation? Where do you cite yourselves in this argument?
To me, this is not at all the case. Organic farming as such is a business. So these farmers also have to guarantee that they have food on their table in the evening. So basically, it's just a method of farming using different sorts of techniques. But with these techniques, I think organic farmers are definitely ones who offer these multiple solutions, multiple benefit solutions, including greenhouse gas emissions and all the rest. So that's my answer.
Thank you very much, Gábor. I think now we can move on to the roundtable discussion, and there's clearly lots to talk about, and I did promise I will come to the floor very soon, but I'd like to kick off with a couple of questions. For the private sector, and I'd like you all to answer this question. We heard from Matthew Reddy about the importance of SDG 17. How important is that, and how important is sustainability at a corporate level? What I mean by that is, to what extent do the kind of things that you're talking about, the kind of advice you give, to what extent is that brought into the core corporate conversation? Maybe I'll start with Romano, as you're looking at me.
So it's a very good question. I can speak for Syngenta. I mean, at Syngenta, we have an initiative that is called the Good Growth Plan. But this is not just another sustainability initiative, but is about the sustainability of our strategy, about the sustainability of our business. So everything we are doing to support the farmer through knowledge transfer, to implement ecological infrastructures, to ensure fair labor at farm level, to improve productivity and quality, it's all embedded in our offers. And it's not a separate layer. And it's not clearly something that just deals with the corporate affairs of the company, but it's really dealing with our commercial people that are helping the farmers to implement these initiatives on their farms.
And to what extent do you see it as having an impact on your bottom line in the years to come?
We have some fantastic examples. I mean, we started this program 3 years ago, and in some of the places that I also mentioned before, for example, in Samara, in southern Russia, we had the land that was abandoned for about 10 years. And we saw that this support over the last 4 years was helping not only to restore the quality of the land, but to increase productivity to the point that our business increased of the 8,000% over 4 years. So doing the right thing, working for sustainability, it's affecting in an extremely positive way the bottom line of the companies.
And at Yara, how closely is the board of directors looking at what you're doing in sustainability?
Sustainability is absolutely key to Yara's strategy. Our slogan is knowledge grows. And this means that knowledge is really what we see as a differentiator in the market. By developing our own knowledge and sharing it with the farmers, and also developing technology and tools and services to help the farmers maximize the return on investment on our products, we can also help them improve their environmental performance. And this is really what sets us aside from our competitors, so that we can, I mentioned Tanzania as one example. If we look to Germany, typically what we do here is to promote precision farming sensors that help farmers reduce the consumption of our products while increasing their yields. Of course, it might seem counterintuitive that we would help the farmers use less of our products, but it's really about being having the most attractive value proposition for the farmer. And this improves environmental performance, and it makes us a more competitive company.
And Chris, the picture at Olam.
Yeah, likewise. I'd mentioned before about dependencies and moving back up the value chain. The value chain is incredibly difficult to work in the further back you go. But the business took a decision that we needed to move in that direction to be able to influence more effectively the changes that need to happen and address the risks and challenges that exist in the value chain. So moving closer to the farmer allows us to understand the challenges. It allows us to then work out the partnerships with the farmer about what is it we need to do in order to increase productivity and focus very much on the long-term security of those relationships. So we don't want to be having to move around looking for new suppliers every season. We want to be able to build long-term relationships. And one example of doing that has been the setting up of processing plants, of the setting up of our own large-scale farms. And then around those operations, those nucleus operations, if you will, we then build those broader, wider, hopefully more knowledge-based supply chains with farmers in the area. So it is about investing in an asset, but it's a long-term investment for the future. And to ensure that asset, a processing plant, is going to be economically viable in the long term, you need a secure supply chain. So the emphasis has then got to be very much on building that supply chain. And again, going back to the points about poverty, really looking at the livelihood challenges that those farmers have. It's not all about the product that we want. It's about the farmer, the communities that they're working in, and are they going to be there for the 20, 30, 40 years that operation is going to be there as well.
Just a quick word from Matthew. Matthew, you said, well, it's clear, isn't it, that the people who we have here on our expert panel are all from companies that are thinking about this area quite deeply, the effects on climate change, and quite a forward-thinking view. Is this representative of the industry, or have you cherry-picked the best ones?
No, I think we have cherry-picked the best ones. I would like to acknowledge the best ones are here, but I think what we show, and I think we refer to that slide that I showed, the value chain there. We have all types of organisations involved, from finance organisations, from retailers, right the way through to organisations that are in the NGO space as well. So I think there is a strong and growing support. So if I can reflect on WBCSD 2 years ago, or prior to Paris, we didn't have an agriculture program. WBCSD didn't have an agriculture program before that. It was organisations like Olam, like Kellogg's, like Monsanto, like Syngenta and Yara that really pushed this program forward. And I would think that this growth in interest in agriculture is somewhat reflected also in the public sector now. We've seen agriculture elevated quite substantially in the discussions around climate change, whereas previously very much focused on the energy sector. But as we recognise now that if the energy sector does achieve its deep cuts, then agriculture will be the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions globally. So I think the companies and the organisations recognise that and are moving and adapting accordingly.
Thank you, Matthew. I think we will throw it to the floor now. Does anyone have any questions? And if you do, please raise your hand. And if you could introduce yourself as well, please.
Good morning or afternoon. My name is Anne-Laure. I'm from a French civil organization, CCFD Terre Solidaire. I'm just surprised that the discussion is only about agriculture, because it's issues in urban environment and land use, and that the panel is not very gender shared, like we don't have any women there. But my question is to Syngenta. I know it's very hard to do conservation agriculture and organic farming at the same time. We need a high intensive use of herbicides and sometimes GMO crops. So I was wondering if this approach and this solution was in line with the Paris Agreement preamble, which is supposed to support food security, but also human rights and obviously health and biodiversity.
Wow. Perhaps let's start from something that Gábor said before, because you mentioned also organic. The organic movement started in 1936. And from that moment, we had the proliferation of a number of movements about sustainable agriculture, of which the climate smart agriculture is the most recent, a complete fruit. This fruit is benefiting from the convergence of all the existing technologies and approaches. So this is why it's really important. because what we say is not that we need to use the same technology or the same approach everywhere, but that we can learn and we can really adapt all the available technologies to really help the rural communities to react in a better way to the changes in climate. And nothing is excluded. Clearly, it's not easy. When we are talking about convergence, I mean, you need a huge knowledge and the ability to combine things that can be potentially very different. But clearly, there is also one element of incorporation of the local knowledge and the local expertise of the environment and the dynamics that only local farmers know really well. And there is one key element as well about making sure that you are meeting the societal expectations. So some parts of society may not want certain technologies or certain approaches. So you need to take this in consideration as well. And this makes the picture quite complex. But I can tell you, we have implemented conservation agriculture in the last 3 years on over 4 million hectares with projects all around the world. And this is particularly about soil management. And we have implemented something like 5 million hectares of ecological infrastructures, mainly to recreate the connectivity in the landscape, but also to provide a number of functional ecological services to the farm activity. So we believe all this is possible. And really, I mean, as a company, we don't exclude any sort of technologies and any sort of approach in our dialogue with farmers. We tend to include everything, including also some important social elements. I mean, like the fair labor conditions. We have one of the biggest seed companies in the world. We pretend that the conditions of farmers in these farms are really meeting the highest standards of fair labor. So we try in our offer to be as complete as possible. Clearly, we are not perfect, and one important element of our activity is partnership. So we leverage a lot on partners that are really experts and really able to deliver things that we are not able to deliver and on which we have no expertise or little expertise.
And Gábor, I'm sure you have something to say about this as well.
Yeah, as I said, organic takes a different approach. We really want to look at the whole range of the benefits. So it's not just about greenhouse gas emissions, but organics is a holistic approach. So we want to have all the ecosystems preserved. We also take into account social issues, gender issues. So this is why the organic approach is the holistic one. This is how, as you mentioned, the whole movement has started. And now we have grown out of this different sort of approaches, which also claim to be sustainable, claim to be climate smart, whatever name we can give to them. But I think in the end, these new movements or new approaches need to justify that they are really sustainable.
Bernhard, I see that you want to come in on this as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to also reflect a little bit on like in conjunction with this theme, one of the points that you made initially, Gábor, about knowledge and knowledge development, because I think that is critically important. If you look at history in the years starting from 1961 and the next 45 years, productivity in agriculture increased substantially. And this also translates into reduced land use change and thereby sparing greenhouse gas emissions. So for every $5 to $7 invested into R&D in agriculture in that period, the world was spared for about 1 ton of CO2 or CO2 equivalent of emissions. So I think that's just an historic illustration of the importance of knowledge development. But I think it's also time to re-emphasize that the world as such is under-investing into agricultural R&D and agricultural development. And that should go both looking at organics and how to best utilize organic nutrient sources when we talk about crop nutrients. And then we, as a fertilizer company, also invest into knowledge expansion on our areas. So our prime advice to the farmers is to maximize the use of organic nutrients that's available on and by the farm. And then we can help the farmers measure how much that is relative to the optimal yield levels at the farm, and thereby provide a more precise advice on whether or not our products are needed and how much of them. So I think a core message here is really that not just us as private sector, but also the global society needs to continue investing into knowledge development and infrastructure building around agriculture.
There are complaints that the pace of change is too slow with regards to making agribusiness more a part of the solution than the problem. I'll turn to Matthew Reddy. Matthew, WBCSD acts as a go-between between the public and private sector. What are the best mechanisms that exist for public-private partnerships, and what would you like to see in the future?
I think you're quite right. The WBCSD does see its role as being a knowledge broker and a convening organisation for these types of initiatives. Absolutely. I think what the WBCSD would see is that we have now a critical mass of corporates. We have a willingness on behalf of the public sector to collaborate more with the private sector. I think that's an evolution that's occurred most recently in the agriculture space, probably in the last 5 years or so. And I think it's actually having these kinds of forums that we see at COP23, the work that we're doing, that will happen at COP23, and the work that we're doing through our multi-stakeholder initiatives, that we can bring these groups together. But first and foremost, it's the conversation and the dialogue that needs to occur between the private sector, NGOs, and other communities. And when I say the private sector, I also mean the farmers themselves. I mean, as we said, the farmers are essential to this also.
We still have time for some more questions. Is there a question we have from the table here? Could you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, yes, I'm Teresa Anderson from ActionAid International. Thank you very much. I was quite interested, considering the title of this event, Attracting Private Sector Engagement for Ambitious Mitigations Actions. I heard a lot about the farmer perspective, but I still wasn't really hearing how this contributes to ambitious mitigation action, considering we're all here because there's a climate crisis. We have, a shrinking carbon budget. We're not really on track for a 1.5 goal. And what are we all going to do to really try to meet that urgent climate goal? And I was hoping to hear more about what your work was going to do towards really being significant towards that target. And so my comment is to you, but also to other countries, negotiators in this room, because the question and the assumption about attracting private sector engagement, I think there needs to be a clearer test when talking and engaging with private sector. So there could be it's interesting to hear about these initiatives, but there needs to be a clear test, which is, do your actions reduce emissions overall, or do they in some ways, through expansion, actually lead to an increase in global emissions? And there needs to be a genuine life cycle analysis test about everything you're doing, because I can hear stories being told, but I'm not really sure if the full picture of the emissions story over, expansion is being told here. So I think that this is a role for countries to consider when engaging with private sector, about the actual climate impact. And then also another test is, are these activities really, are they offering the best alternative, or are there better alternatives from what is being offered by some of these private sector options? And I would I really think that it's great that IFOAM and the organic story is being heard on this table, because we know that not only does it actually genuinely reduce emissions over the full life cycle analysis, but it also adds to adaptation and has all of these other social benefits. So sometimes when private sector is, you know, presented as a solution, there may be other solutions available that are even better. And so I urge countries to consider these questions when they engage on this. And just to flag that Monsanto was, you know, we're civil society. We can't hear the word Monsanto without rising to it. So apologies for being predictable. But I mean, we've heard in the negotiations here, there's been a big discussion about conflict of interest and some countries forcefully defending, you know, the role for fossil fuel companies being here in this space. We have to be very, very careful that we don't include companies that have such a toxic reputation that they really end up undermining the reputation of this whole process and what we're trying to achieve here. So these are just some warnings to flag for you on the board, but also for other parties here as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your questions. I know Chris Blair from Olam wants to respond, but before then, you mentioned the countries. Do any of the countries have anything they want to say about a systematic approach that they have to the impact of agriculture and agribusiness? I'll take that as a no. Okay, so let's move over to Chris. Oh, there is I beg your pardon. I couldn't see. Hungary. Hungary wants to say something, I think.
So, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to, if already the balance between the gender balance was mentioned, let's mention also the balance between the observers and the parties as well. And that's why I'm, as a party, please allow me just to raise some issues. Yes, I fully agree with the fact to put the farmer itself in the center of all these actions. And when it comes to the farmers, then the profitability is also in the core line. Well, if possible, with some incentives, with the mitigations as well. But when it comes to the profitability from the economic perspectives, there is always a question: how a farm, what's the size of the farm, the minimum size that is profitable? My question is whether you, when you give some incentives to mitigate, do you consider also the size of the farms? Because I believe that, well, let's put it on the table. In the land use, not only agriculture but also forestry is included anyhow. And if a private forest owner, just to shift a bit the subject, the private forest owners with the ownership of, let's say, 1.5 hectares is willing to make a living out of its property, that is impossible. So there is no incentive that can make him or her to mitigate rather than to do something else with its property. So there should be somehow a limit, an economic limit of the size of the farm, it says. My question is, once again, do you consider, and if you do, how you do that? Because that would also be somehow interesting also for the rest of the world. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd just like to respond to the first points that were made. Yeah, it's difficult to get across the scope of what we're doing in sort of 3 minutes earlier. But in response to cast iron solid solutions that have been implemented, just taking rice, there are 4 solutions that we've identified as Olam, working with GIZ and the Thai rice department. We've identified looking at laser land leveling, such that's reducing runoff and therefore reducing runoff of inputs, reducing soil erosion. Looking at the inputs themselves, so how can better varieties reduce GHGs, and evidence there is you can reduce GHGs in rice by 10% just through the inputs alone. Looking at farming methods, so things like alternate wet and dry, the rice sustainable rice intensification, as two key proponents of that. But then looking at off-farm, what else can we be doing? So biomass removal. So bearing in mind that we want some rice straw remaining on the field, looking at bioenergy uses and looking at other opportunities to utilize rice straw in things like particle board. So these are all things that are being built into a solid proposal that at the moment is exceedingly advanced in the NAMA process with Thailand. So that's again the science and the detail behind the GHG mitigation in relation to that is part of the NAMA process. Also, countries like Ghana, as an example, in their INDCs, products like cocoa were specifically stated as focus areas. So again, it's working with government and other actors, NGOs, civil society, our customers, competitors, farmers as well. And one area that's just been driven forward is the Cocoa and Forest Initiative in partnership with World Cocoa Foundation to end deforestation and forest degradation, and then looking at how do we start to reforest? How do we start to utilize shade trees more effectively? So when we started looking at shade trees as an example, creating the microclimate for being able to boost productivity of cocoa, we were planting 50 shade trees per hectare. And now with partnership with timber companies, they're providing farmers with 100 native varieties per hectare to supplement, to diversify that income. Coming back to how do you manage on such a small area of land? So it's about technology and diversification and access to market and access to finance and inputs to allow that to happen. So 100 trees per hectare for forestry, so a more longer term income, but as well providing 300 trees per hectare to increase shade to boost productivity. And again, this is relatively new. This is a couple of years in. Absolutely measuring the impacts is the key thing here now. We've got to be able to prove this concept is contributing tangibly towards the GHG mitigation requirements, as well as how do we make smallholders more productive to secure and build resilient livelihoods for those farmers as well.
I mean, these are positive case studies, but I think part of the question is, do you look across your whole portfolio and measure the impact of the company on GHG emissions?
Yeah, as I said, it's how to do that when changes are occurring slowly. So this is something that's built that we're on with. So through each of those programs, measuring or estimating the change, and then measuring progressively the positive, hopefully positive impact that these are having, and then incorporating more knowledge and technologies and innovation from farmers as well within that. So this is early days, but it is part of what we do. Again, there's plenty of case studies, but the challenge is scaling up now.
Okay, I'll just get a brief input on that from Yara and Syngenta. Do you look across your whole portfolio and measure the impact that your company is having on greenhouse gas emissions?
Yes, we do. I think primarily we do need to accept that we have a huge responsibility for our own operations. So our reporting is approved by 2 different external independent parties, just to reassure that we are reporting the right things. I think Hungary posed a critically important question that's frequently overlooked, actually. We have taken a look at average farm sizes in the FAO databases and looked at how this is developing over time. And in several developing economies, we can observe that the average farm size is decreasing. And it's coming down to a level where growing your typical agricultural commodities isn't going to provide a decent livelihood on those small farms. So there's actually a lack of a coherent strategy in place in order to create optional economic opportunities for these growing rural populations. And that is something we do not have a complete answer to that. We can help increase productivity on existing farmland, but how to grow that total rural economy, given that land use change should be limited, we need to have more partners on board in that discussion, actually.
So yes, we do. We measure the greenhouse gas emission, and we do it clearly for our operations. This is already disclosed systematically in our annual report. For the activity on farm, we do it. We try to measure both the carbon sequestration in the soil or in the ecological infrastructures that we are creating, but also the mitigation of carbon release that is resulting from the change of agriculture practice. And this is all referring to, I would say, the literature of the last 20 years. So it's quite clear, although, I mean, there are several different methodologies used. And we share also this information in open data, so for scientists really to look at it and use it for their research. Is the size then of the farm an issue? We work with many commercial smallholders with 2 hectares, and we see that, I mean, does not really change completely reality. The problem is that it's a multitude of farmers that is difficult to reach sometimes. But it's also a matter of thinking about their profitability and thinking about some innovative solutions. For example, we are working right now with extension services in China on some of the provinces to allow smallholders to create field margins on their land that are creating a number of benefits in terms of reducing runoff, in terms of protecting soil from erosion, protecting water quality. But clearly, I mean, the cost of this investment needs to be paid off by introducing these field margins, some cash crops that they can sell to the local market. So it's always a matter to have very clear in mind that measurements are one part of the picture. The other part of the picture is clearly the profitability of the farmer. They need to implement all these measures.
Okay, we can take another question.
Thank you panel, for your interesting presentations and the discussion that's followed. I would just like to acknowledge an earlier question from Action Aid International, giving countries an opportunity to showcase what they're doing and engaging the private sector in mitigating greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture and other land use. So I'd just like to give an example of what New Zealand is doing in this space. New Zealand is has an agricultural-based economy. A large proportion of our export earnings come from primary products. Furthermore, we have an unsubsidized agricultural system. So there are no government subsidies available for farmers. Farms are private businesses and they rely on making a profit to make a living and continue. So on top of that complexity, nearly 49% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from the agricultural sector, so it's a real challenge. Therefore, engaging with the private sector is really, very, very important for the New Zealand government. And as part of the review of our emissions trading scheme, the government has established a biological emissions reference group to build a solid evidence base on what the sector can do to reduce emissions and the cost and opportunities of doing so. The group is made up of government officials and primary sector stakeholders. So that's one example of what the New Zealand government is doing in engaging with the private sector to really mitigate or explore opportunities to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. Thank you for the opportunity to share that example. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Can you tell us about some of the results of that partnership?
Yeah, the group's actually only just been set up recently, so we're waiting. We're expecting a report to be produced by the end of the year. Thanks.
Yeah, I think WBCSD would like to recognise the work that New Zealand has done in supporting the Global Research Alliance and its work with Landcare Research over the years. and that does inform the work that we do. So I think the work of New Zealand is well recognised by the private sector.
Okay, I think we have another question. Yep.
Okay, thank you very much for this great opportunity to hear the various ideas and the experiences. Thank you very much. My name is Yasuko. I would like to some question and comment. So it is almost of panelists indicated that for the private sector in agriculture, the importance is technology and knowledge and infrastructure, etc. So, but I wonder, it is also some missing point to the private sector or profitable farming business in this world in terms of the cash crop trading, etc. So the one thing is that as World Trade Organization negotiations always so have been the point of discussion is that the have been that the very difference in the government support to the farmers. For example, in the developed countries, received subsidies like the 40% or 90% of their value of the product is subsidized, while in terms of it in Africa, people receive almost nothing because they are indebted, and the government are not allowed to subsidize for their farmers, and also it is difficult to develop and get such African countries also should have opportunities to grow their own business based, like the seed companies or fertilizer companies or various sort of farming companies should be able to be developed. But today's panelists are based on in the developed countries, and so they are transnational companies and doing business in Africa or any other world. But so what is the enabling any idea to? Do you have any idea to grow for African countries? Can grow their own private sector to develop their own farming and to support their own farmers? That is my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So how can Africa grow its sector? Maybe Theo, that's probably one for you.
In my opening statement, I said that the market is so extremely important because it pulls the whole chain. The fact is that in Africa, intra-Africa trade amounts to less than 3% of all the food and fiber that's traded on the continent. We have not even started to trade with ourselves. And the real reason for it is that it is still cheaper to bring a container full of maize down the Mississippi across the Atlantic to Cape Town Harbor than what it is to take that same container from Cape Town to Lusaka. The main constraint is policy issues. It's very hard to move, especially fresh produce, foods, across borders when you're held up for 7 days at the border post and you are stopped around every corner at an informal roadblock or toll gate and you have to cough up. Governance is the biggest single challenge in the developing of intra-Africa trade, especially when it comes to agricultural produce. But well, having said that, the main purpose of a farmers' organization is advocacy, is to influence policy. And it's only very recently, over the last 5 years, that we have seen developments such as regional farmers' organizations. Only in 2010 was the Pan-African Farmers Organization launched. It is only now that there's robust engagement between independent farmers' organizations, independent from the states, and COMESA, ECOWAS, the regional economic commissions, and the African Union. And there's a long road ahead still. There are still 5 countries in Africa who do not have a national farmers organization independent of the state. We are investing a lot in capacity building in farmers organizations for that very reason. We must make the policy environment conducive to business in agriculture.
Yeah, just very quickly, and it's not all bad news, as has been said there. One of the things that Olam did, we were born in Nigeria as a company. So Africa, in essence, is Olam's home continent. So one of the biggest drivers, the strategic drivers for us, again, is this nucleus operation. It's putting the processing plant in the country of origin. So it's cocoa factories in Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire. It's our wheat milling operations in Nigeria. It's cashew processing in Mozambique. So one of the big strategic drivers we've seen, and again, it's a gap in the market. Is there a pull? And we believe there is. So it's about investing where we think there's going to be a market opportunity, and building employment, building those assets, building those supply chains. It's incredibly risky. It really is. And we would welcome more people to look at this and help us in terms of the discussions that need to be had with governments. And it's also about supporting, again, the point, building farmer cooperatives, building the voice to help influence policy conversations, because it can't just come from an international company. It needs to come from within. So hopefully that stimulation in time will come to fruition.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. And I think that what we've seen here, that collaboration, cooperation are extremely important. Collaboration, cooperation between the public and private sector are extremely important. It does seem it is still early days in this process, but there is willing on both sides to reduce the impact of agriculture and agribusiness when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. I do apologize. There was one more question from Congo and the European Union, and then we will have to come to the end of this session. Congo first.
Thank you, sir, for letting me express my idea here. First of all, I'm surprised that Olam, Mr. Brown, didn't mention what CIB, which is a branch of Olam in Congo, have been doing so far. And
it's a flagship operation that we're very proud of.
We've been using sawmill waste in producing energy. So it's one of the biggest initiative we need to spread in Congo. So I'm surprised, because this is one of the mitigation action we did. Also, yes, we have done so many positive action in forest management too. So I think it's need to be mentioned. Another point, it's when it comes to Africa, I focus on cassava culture instead of rice, for example. Might be an interesting adaptation and mitigation action, and a very good issue orientation for sustainable land use and many other co-benefits. So I would like to know if there is any of you who is willing to invest in the cassava culture in Africa or not. Because if you bring rice in Africa, I don't think that we always reach a sustainable goal. Thank you.
I can, again, very quickly on cassava and picking up on diversification. Cassava is one of the diversification crops that we're working with cotton farmers on. So it's a big program At the moment, part of, I think it's in Côte d'Ivoire is the main area. But it's around within a farmer's area, what are the other things in addition to the main cash crop that we want to work with those farmers on? So it's small scale at the moment. I think there's also some discussions with our wheat milling business around how do we grow the cassava supply chains and incorporate cassava into that business as well. So some fledgling discussions at the moment, but definitely an area that at government level is being identified and questions being asked to business.
And we'll take the last question from the European Union.
Thank you, first of all, for organizing this excellent panel and this very interesting discussion. I just wanted, because you asked for experiences from countries, highlight an initiative which is funded or supported by the European Commission, several member states, called Resilience, which is quite similar to what I think Syngenta is also working on, where we target specifically on reducing climate risks and focusing on adaptation. But obviously that also has other implications that farmers can invest, for example, in more climate smart agriculture, and in that sense take the risk. So we see this as an important initiative which you're supporting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much to our expert panel and to Matthew Reddy from WBCSD and Theo de Jager from the World Farmers Organization. As Matthew said, the presentation will be available later, and Matthew will tomorrow be giving a brief summing up of the main issues that were discussed here and some of the key talking points to come out of this session. Thank you very much and enjoy lunch.